Hello, Year 10. It's Mr. Boff here. I want to present to you today the poem Ozymandias, okay, the 1817 poem published a year later in 1818, okay. I want to present this as I did with William Blake's London on its own. This poem by Shelley is magnificent and is widely anthologized, which means that it's in many, many anthologies. In fact, even people who aren't that keen on poetry have often heard or come across at least quotations from Ozymandias. It's one of the most important and famous poems in the English language, and therefore well worth knowing, regardless of the fact that it's actually on our one of the GCSE anthology poems. So that's why it's made it into this anthology. It's in lots of other anthologies. And it's a wonderful poem. It's a really, really rich poem in only 14 lines, and we'll come to the implications of the fact that it's 14 lines long. In only 14 lines, it says quite a great deal about power, about time, about art, about truth, about the nature of human voices, and how we understand all of those things. And I dare say it is even perhaps more important given all of the discussions about statues and the purpose and role of statues in societies, in our society, and obviously the tearing down of the Colston slaver statue in Bristol, and there's lots of other statues that people want to take down for all sorts of important historical reasons. And that kind of the role of public sculpture is explored in this poem too, although as we will find out, the sculpture of Ozymandias, the Greek name for a real life figure, Ramesses II, okay, as we'll find out, his statue is not very public anymore, unfortunately for him. Okay, so this is Ozymandias by Shelley. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." Okay, so it's a wonderful poem, very, very powerful and very moving in its own way. Okay, there's lots going on here. What do we need to think about? What's the kind of story? And even that becomes kind of intriguingly complex as we begin to unpick it. But broadly speaking, we have the initial voice of the poem, the persona, telling us that he meets this traveller who then tells him this kind of little travel narrative, really, this travel story. He basically tells him about this experience in Egypt that this traveller's had. So we've got first voice, I, the I who meets the traveller, and then we've got the reporting of the traveller's voice. One thing that's worth noting is we're talking about Egypt here. So this is a traveller who has come from Egypt. That's the antique land, and Egypt and what we would call Egyptology was extremely popular in this period, and Shelley will have read, certainly will have read all sorts of travel logs of people exploring Egypt, and there were some really, really big archaeological finds as well during the period. So Egypt was almost like a bit of a craze. Egyptology was, it was a kind of fashionable thing to be interested in. Hence why we've got Ozymandias here, or one of the reasons. So first voice, I met a traveller. Then we've got the voice of the traveller, and then we've got these words, which are on a pedestal beneath what's now a half-sunk, broken, worn away, eroded statue of the titular Ozymandias. We've got the words of Ozymandias himself etched into the pedestal. Okay, my name is Ozymandias. So we've got a range of voices, okay? The last few lines, last 3 lines, we imagine that these are also the words of the traveller. But that's kind of interesting. We've got multiple voices. So one of the things that is notable about this poem is it is it's polyphonic. It's full of multiple sounds, multiple voices. Okay, and that's a really important thing to consider and bear in mind, that we've not just got one clear, definite poetic voice. We've got multiple. Okay, so meet a traveller, and the traveller describes this huge stone statue. Broken visage, broken face. We'll come to some of these really, really interestingly ambiguous words shortly. And it's been eroded by time. And there's a kind of an amusing, interesting, instructive irony, okay, in Ozymandias's supposedly kind of incredibly powerful, arrogant declaration. My name is Ozymandias, king of kings, the king of all the kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. Like, look at how powerful I am. And of course, there's nothing around. There's just this statue in the kind of bare sands of the desert. It is both a literal and figurative desert. Okay, there's no sign of human life other than this eroded, worn away, shattered statue of Ozymandias. So there's a kind of irony there that Ozymandias's words mean one thing, and yet they have a kind of other meaning that we are able as the reader to interpret that actually runs counter. You know, king of kings, he's king of nobody. Okay, look on my works, ye mighty in despair. What works? There are no works. There's no reason to despair. The mighty Ozymandias is in fact kind of pathetic, simply this broken down statue in the desert. So we've got a poem that's interested in power and hubris and the what we might call the erosive power of time. Now what this reminds us is that all human power, even seemingly enormous mighty power, is eroded by time. The statue itself is eroded by time, but also of course, Ozymandias is dead, and his power is non-existent now. So there's a reminder that all human power is finite and therefore limited, because of course human beings, no matter who they are, richest or poorest, are mortal. Now, it's probably instructive to just know a little bit about Shelley's politics. Shelley wrote some extremely radical poems. In fact, most of the time, people publishers were very reluctant to publish Shelley's poetry. It was sort of underground because his poetry was so subversive and revolutionary, similar to our friend William Blake. So people would be reading Shelley's poetry kind of in a secretive way. Certainly it wouldn't be widely published. You'd have to sort of in the know someone who could get you copies of his pamphlets and his poetry. And that's interesting because, Shelley was deeply critical of, he was very anti-royal. He was interestingly a big proponent of vegetarianism, of non-violence. His radical politics influenced people like Mahatma Gandhi, big influence on someone like Karl Marx, okay, who repeatedly writes about how much he enjoyed and appreciated the poetry of Shelley. So there are, and never mind all of the poets who either live shortly after, generation or two after Shelley, is an enormously influential figure. Okay, so really, really subversive, challenging. Figure in all sorts of different ways, very critical of the rich, very, very critical of the royals. In fact, he was, vehemently anti-royal, one of the reasons why publishers were so reluctant to publish his stuff. So, this is a kind of person we've got writing this. So it comes as perhaps less of a surprise that we've got a poem, this wonderful sonnet, I'll come to that in a minute, this wonderful poem that's reminding us power is finite. You can seem to be the most powerful, long-lasting leader, and you know what? Ultimately, you're going to find yourself like Ozymandias, a shattered visage lying in a barren desert, devoid of life and largely forgotten. Okay, so I mentioned it's a sonnet. It's a 14-line poem, and it follows. And I don't want to get bogged down in this insofar as sometimes students can just mention this on its own as if it's just an interesting fact. Okay, it's not. We need to think about this in terms of what impact does it have on meaning. Right, so Shelley has chosen even to write in the sonnet form. Now, the sonnet form is associated with love, but also the kind of the ravages of time. There's an irony here as well. A sonnet, very, very famous series of all sorts of famous love sonnets. Okay, Shakespeare writes many, many love sonnets, as well as sonnets about the ravages of time. What we've got here is a kind of self-love, though. There's a sort of irony in Shelley choosing the sonnet form, this 14-line form and he does some kind of interesting things with it. But there's an irony here that he's perhaps mocking the self-love of the rich and powerful. When I read Ozymandias, I think of people who might sort of fit the modern bill, who would be our kind of modern day equivalent of Ozymandias. You could definitely see elements of this kind of hubris in someone like Donald Trump, I think. But I also think that you see that kind of hubris in someone like Elon Musk, possibly even Jeff Bezos. These kind of extremely wealthy, powerful figures who sort of imagine that they can do anything, and interestingly, they seem sort of obsessed with space and the idea of using their enormous wealth and power to kind of almost like begin the process of colonizing space. There's a sort of hubris there to these people, these extremely rich CEOs of companies, that definitely kind of plays in and reminds us about the figure of Ozymandias, or Ramesses II, to give him his Egyptian name. Okay, so let's go through the poem. You can read the poem as many times as you want simply by pausing. We're going to go through this line by line. Okay, we're going to be thinking about this sonnet form, and we're going to be thinking about some of the interesting things that Shelley does, particularly around certain ambiguities in meaning and in specific language choices. Okay, so we've got this opening. I met a traveller from an antique land. Okay, we've got this sort of long history of travel narratives that I think he's playing into, or tapping into. Okay, I met a traveller from an antique land. There's a little bit of ambiguity even in the opening line. I met a traveller from an antique land. So does he mean that the traveller has come back from an antique land? That's probably the way I would read it. But there is a slight kind of odd note here. There's the possible hint of, has the traveller actually come from that antique land themselves? That is, have they travelled across time? Or are they simply coming from an ancient place? Okay, so we could, if we're going to be slightly fancy, okay, there's immediately, and this occurs throughout, there's a sort of temporal uncertainty in this poem. From whence has this person come? Where have they come from? So I met a traveller from an antique land who said, and now, so we've got one voice, and now we've got the second voice, okay? So we've got this second voice. And this is what they say. Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, we've got the ellipsis, near them on the sand. So we've got this broken statue. It's really broken. These huge trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand. Okay, now there's a long connection between sand and time. In a way, sand itself is a physical manifestation of the erosive power of time. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that what's sand made of? It's rock that's been eroded away that forms sand. So sand is itself a kind of physical reminder, manifestation of the fact that time and these kind of geological processes result in erosion, that they wear things away to sand. But also there's a long history between, sand, think of time as sand pouring, like my life is like pouring away like sand between my fingers, that sand becomes a kind of metaphor for time itself. So always bringing it back to this idea of time and the impact of time on power and on mortal human beings. Near them on the sand, so just these legs, there's something kind of slightly trunkless legs, there's something kind of pathetic about that image. Near them on the sand, half sunk. So again, almost being kind of consumed by the sand to nothing, to be totally hidden. Half sunk, a shattered visage. Now, we need to pick out this word visage or visage if we want to be a little bit fancy. Now, we take that in English to mean one's face, but it can also mean something along the lines of showy and insincere. This idea of the visage, the face broken, being kind of for show. The face of the statue is for show, but is therefore insincere. And again, we've got a little bit of a play on words. A shattered visage lies. Now that is lies in the physical sense. It's like lying on the ground. But the shattered visage lies. As in, people in power lie. The deception of the wealthy and powerful. The powerful lie to us, okay? Whose frown and wrinkled lip, and this is a great line, and sneer of cold command. Okay, we've got this great list now of physical features on the statue, on the face of the statue. The frown, the wrinkled lip, and this great line, sneer of cold command. Sneer. Look at this kind of arrogance, the arrogance of power, this sort of supercilious sense of superiority. Okay, lots of sibilance in that line. Sneer of cold command. Cold, emotionally cold, distant. We've got lots going on here. We've got arrogance. We've got distance. This doesn't... He sees himself as superior to ordinary people. If we're being maybe slightly uncharitable, this idea that the rich and the powerful don't understand ordinary people and in fact see themselves as separate and different to ordinary people is something that is constantly levelled at the rich and the powerful today, that they're sort of removed from our lives. A really good example of that recently would be even, now he said he was tired and it was to do with Harry Potter, but even, Matt Hancock calling Marcus Rashford Daniel Rashford seems to speak to, whether this is true or not, it seems to have a kind of express a broader truth that people who are in positions of power don't really sort of get ordinary life and consider themselves often superior, sneer at ordinary people. So this idea of the distance of the rich and the powerful from ordinary people, very important here. Sneer of cold command. Look at this sort of sense of authority. Ozymandias, as I said, is a Greek name for Ramesses II. He was known for being like one of the kind of king at the peak of Egyptian imperial power. So if anyone had a serious command, it would have been someone like Ramesses II. So I think as well, Shelley's really, choosing his historical figures wisely here. If someone's going to have a sneer of cold command, it's probably going to be Ramesses II. Okay, well, you can have a look. There's a statue you can even look at. Tell that its sculptor well those passions read. Okay, tell that its sculptor well those passions read. So what this means is, if we're thinking about this line here, is that the sculptor, the person who made this statue, who sculpted this statue, read the passions, the emotions, the feelings of Ozymandias well. He read them well. He read them accurately. And there's a kind of subversiveness here that's implied, that the sculptor, who was presumably asked by Ozymandias to sculpt this powerful statue of him, has, through a kind of truthfulness, conveyed honestly and truthfully the passions and feelings and attitudes of Ozymandias. His wrinkled lip, the frown, all negative facial expressions, and sneer. There's a sense in which the sculptor has kind of almost done his job too well, too accurate a sculpture that is perhaps showing and conveying a truth that maybe the person who commissioned the sculpture, Ozymandias, maybe wouldn't be all that keen on, which yet survive. So in this poem, what survives is not earthly power, but art and truth survive. Really, really important. Shelley's a romantic poet, romantic with a capital R. Art and truth are really important questions, ideas for romantic poets and romanticism more generally. And in fact, art is viewed as expressing a kind of truth that can't be expressed really in any other way. And it's art and truth that survive, or truth through art that survives when mortal human power is shown to be absolutely finite. Okay, which yet survives, stamped on these lifeless things. Stamped on these lifeless things. There's a sense of artistic labour here. That the sculptor stamps truth onto these lifeless things, onto the stone that is sculpted. Stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. Okay, now, I've always found this line extremely ambiguous. It's not entirely clear whose hand and whose heart are being discussed. Is it the hand and the heart of Ozymandias, that is, the hand that mocked them, the people, Ozymandias' hand that mocked the people, and his heart that fed? Not quite sure what that means. That's possibly conveying a sense of sort of domination, but also a degree of care. Or is it the sculptor, the sculptor's hand that mocks them? And again, mock is a really important word. To mock is to ridicule, but it's also to mimic. That the statue mimics, it's mock, so we might talk about a house having a kind of mock Tudor front, that is a sort of a copy, and mockingbirds, copy other birds. So this idea of mimicry, of copying. So the sculptor is mocking the is mocking Ozymandias. That is, the sculpture is mimicking Ozymandias' facial expression, and yet at the same time he's also mocking him. He's ridiculing him. There's another play on words, just like lies, okay? Just like visage. There's lots and lots of ambiguity in this poem. It's kind of subversive. Okay, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. So again, is this the heart that fed? Is this the sort of artistic heart of the sculptor whose heart is kind of feeding him, nourishing him artistically to produce these kinds of works of art? Okay. And now we've got a shift. Interestingly, this fits in with the kind of typical Petrarchan sonnet format, octet and sestet, 8 lines, 6 lines. Okay, so we've got some elements of an earlier sonnet form. There are also connections between this sonnet and a Shakespearean sonnet, and there are also some things that this poem does that are kind of Shelley's own creation. So he sort of takes bits of other sonnet forms, Petrarchan and Shakespearean particularly, but then crafts something new out of them himself. Okay, so now we've got a shift, and we're onto the pedestal. We've got this other voice coming through, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias. These are, we presume, the words of Ozymandias that he wanted inscribed at the base of the statue on the pedestal. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. I mean, look at this hubris. It's a fantastic. It's often used as an example of hubris. In fact, I think there's an episode of Breaking Bad that actually uses this entire poem to convey Walter White's increasing sense of hubris as he becomes a very effective producer of drugs and distributor of drugs. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Huge amounts of hubris, overwhelming arrogance and pride. Look on my works. Look at this command. Look on my works. Okay, there's a cold command coming through. Ye mighty. Okay, you might consider yourselves mighty, but you're not as mighty as Ozymandias is, although we see this as deeply ironic, and despair. Okay, I mean, look at this. A leader who wants us to see what he's done and not be amazed or impressed, but to cause despair, to cause fear. What an interesting expression of the kind of horrors of authority. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. What a interesting declaration that is. Okay? Well, it's a command. Now, this is ironic because, okay, Ozymandias, I'll take you at your word. I'll look on your works. Nothing beside remains. This is deeply ironic. Almost to the point of being kind of amusing that we get to enjoy the irony of Ozymandias' grand pronouncement and command, and this immediate, it's like a huge balloon being rapidly punctured. Nothing beside remains. Punctured. Okay, that hubris. Punctured. Pause in the middle of the line, that use of caesura. Nothing beside remains. Bang, stop, think. That's what we do. Round the decay of that colossal wreck. Isn't this an interesting juxtaposition? Colossal and wreck. So on the one hand, we've got colossal. And on the other hand, we've got wreck. So colossal speaks to a desire for spectacle and outward expressions of power. But again, there's this sort of sense of a kind of hubristic balloon being punctured. Colossal, wreck, bang, punctured again. That again, it's the erosive and the erosive power of time, and the really important word in this poem, actually, it's not in the poem, but when speaking about it or writing about it, the transient nature of power. You know, what can seem long-lasting, infinitely powerful, can be gone in a matter of hours, days, weeks. And we've seen this, haven't we? You know, that dictators' power, for example, can seem absolutely total 1 minute and then total collapse within the space of a week. I mean, think about the collapse of the Soviet Union. You've got this enormous group of nations, millions of people, seems totally powerful, and then in a matter of months no longer exists. So this idea of the finite nature of human power is very, very important in this poem. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, what a fantastic juxtaposition that is, of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. Okay, we've got those punchy plosives, boundless and bare. It really is laying it on thick. The lone and level, again, lone and level sands stretch far away. There's no accord here, as you might expect to find at the end of a sonnet. You would expect to find a rhyming couplet, but there's no rhyming couplet there. So there's a kind of disconnect, or almost kind of like discordant note, bare and away, between those two final lines. It's not sort of neatly wrapped up. It's kind of uncomfortable, the lack of a rhyme, one might say. So, a poem about the transient nature of power, a poem that introduces some interesting questions of kind of narrative perspective and view, a sort of polyphonic poem in that sense, a poem that is interested in the ambiguities of language and of puns, of playing on words, a poem that is interested in the ravages and erosive power of time. It's a poem that's about the fact that, statues which are meant to symbolise one thing can come to symbolise something else, very, very pertinent to our present moment. Okay, those statues that people want to take down, people see them as expressions of a particular kind of power, a white power, the power of white people who were slavers, and they find that disgusting and repellent and wish to take them down, see those statues removed, because they symbolise something really, really important. And what we've got here is a kind of sort of ironic inversion, that what once symbolised a very public expression of this king's power, this, in his own words, king of kings, has become nothing. Nothing beside remains. We've got words like decay, this idea of things being worn down over time to almost nothing. It's shattered. It's half sunk. And all the while, Shelley's again doing this kind of ironic nudge and kind of winking at us as the reader. This is a sonnet. Sonnets are typically love poems. And here's a poem pulling apart in the most wonderful, concise, brief way the hubris of the rich and the powerful. Because whether you like it or not, one day we all die. It's the only certainty in human life is its finitude, it's finite, and therefore this is a poem that's a very salutary, important reminder of that finite nature of human existence. So I hope that this has been a useful video. I hope this has clarified a couple of things about the poem, that's helped you again understand that I'm not solving a puzzle or unpicking a riddle. When I come back to this poem, it sort of speaks to me afresh every single time, but it's reading with a different kind of focus and attention to perhaps how we ordinarily read. And that's what poetry asks of us, or can ask of us. And importantly, poetry also responds to that particular style of reading. So I hope you found this useful. Don't forget, the way you'd be using this is obviously to read through the poem, think very carefully about it. You're probably going to want to split up your viewings of this video over multiple sessions, and make sure that you've got my annotations and any other annotations that you come up with on your own as you read through it many, many times, so that you're also bringing your own interpretations, which, as long as you can back them up, are perfectly valid. So, as ever, thanks for watching.